By 1453, the fall of Constantinople was already forthcoming for many years, as many have described the Eastern Roman Empire in the last 70 years of its survival an island within an Ottoman sea, ready for the Ottomans to devour it. Today we wanna challenge that claim. How much of an island was the empire really? Besides Constantinople itself, what other territories did the empire actually control during the 1450s? What influence could the empire assert at this point? In this video, we'll try to provide an overview as exhaustive as possible of these territories, with cases that might surprise even experienced Eastern Roman history enjoyers. And finally, we'll discuss if, in any case, those extra territories and influence could provide a springboard for the empire to be reborn again, or at least keep the Ottomans at bay. First and foremost, we'll start this analysis with the biggest and most substantial piece of territory under the empire's control, the Morea. The Eastern Romans at the time controlled this territory almost in its entirety, excluding four notable exceptions: the fortified towns of Koroni and Methoni in the southwest, as well as Nafplio and Argos in the northeast, all four controlled by Venice. Those four towns consisted of important trade centers in the region, but were by far not the only notable places around the peninsula. Key places on the Morea under Roman control include Mystras. This was the de facto capital of the region, being an administrative, military and even cultural center, thanks in part to the philosophical school established by the philosopher Plithon Gemistos. Located close to ancient Sparta, this was a walled town atop of a steep mountainside, fortified on all sides and heavily populated with tall and elaborate buildings, rich monasteries and churches, as well as palaces for the local despots, the Paleologi family. Mystras was a true micrography of Constantinople itself. Monemvasia, an even more impressive town located on the eastern shores of the peninsula, built on the side and the top of a huge island-shaped rock, connected to the mainland with a thin stretch of land. The town had remained in Roman hands for many years, and even during the Latin conquest only been conquered in 1242 and then handed back just 17 years later, proving a strong defensible position. Monemvasia served as a trade center for the whole region and provided much of the state income received by the capital. Patras and Corinth, both ancient cities dating back to the times of ancient Greece, were now walled settlements, easily defensible and with a substantial population for the age. Though far away from their prime years, both cities had been famous in the previous centuries for their cloth production and are frequently mentioned in records during the entirety of the Middle Ages. Aside from those places of significance, the Peloponnese was also home to many other fortresses and small fortified towns, like Geraki in Laconia, Gardiki in the center of the peninsula, Arcadia in the southwest, Sandomeri in the northwest, as well as several others like Kalamata, Vostitsa and Kalavrita. It has to be noted that many of these territories had been reconquered by the Romans by the last emperor Constantine Palaiologos during his year as a despot in the Morea, being thus freshly conquered land, as is the case for Patra and Sandomeri. Just a few years prior, the Romans were mainly in control of the southeastern part of the peninsula, with the rest being the domains of the Latin Principality of Achaia. It is worth noting, however, that Constantine also campaigned north, outside the peninsula, occupying Athens, Thebes and even Phocis, reaching up to the Pindus mountains, only to be driven back by the Ottomans in 1446, who assaulted the Hexamilion Wall with 50,000 to 60,000 men, overrunning the defenses and bringing destruction to some northern parts of the region, forcing Constantine to become their nominal vassal. As a conclusion, the situation in Morea in 1453 was not desperate, with significant Roman centers on the peninsula. There was definitely potential for setting up a power base there, as the region is of a substantial size and was protected by sea from all sides and the Hexamilion Wall from land. The wall may have been easily overrun, but the Ottomans only did so with a substantial army. Probably it could hold back less numerous opponents. Just for perspective, low-end estimates range on just 30% more men in the siege of Constantinople, which was a key expedition of the era. Having to organize such a large force of 50,000 to 60,000 troops against the Morea proves the significance of the region. In addition, before the siege of Constantinople, the Ottomans diverted some of the resources towards guarding southern Greece as a measure to deter any Roman counterattacks, a fact that proves even more the danger that the Morea might pose to the Ottomans. It has to be noted, however, that several disloyal populations also lived in the peninsula, like Albanians, bandits and supporters of the Latin Zaccaria rulers. Those were ousted by the Paleologi in the previous years. Also, the region was not politically unified, with civil war breaking out right after the fall of the capital between the last emperor's brothers in combination with revolts by the local populace. It was the proximity of Constantinople that several territories were still controlled by the Romans until the very end, territories which, even not vast, could provide a significant amount of support and revenue, and may be much more noteworthy than it would appear on a first glance. Mesembria on the shores of the Black Sea was an ancient Greek colony and an important stronghold of the Eastern Romans in the region, even from the early imperial years. The city was fought over by Bulgarians and Romans alike during its 1,000 years of existence. Mesembria was eventually lost to the Turks before 1402, but was returned to the empire in 1403 through the Treaty of Gallipoli, which took place after the defeat of the Ottomans by Timur between the Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos, Constantine's father, and Suleiman Çelebi, the claimant of the vacant Ottoman throne at the time, who controlled the Balkans. Mesembria, today's Mesembria in Bulgaria, was also the northernmost possession of the Romans, and it was handed over to the Hungarians on the promise of help in 1452, just before the final siege. Anchialos shares a similar story to Mesembria, and it is the next town to be encountered southwards, also sharing a similar topography, as it is also located on a small island-shaped peninsula. The city was home to Michael III of Anchialos, Patriarch of Constantinople, from 1170 to 1178. Sozopolis and Burgas also share many similarities with the previous two located on the same gulf, the Burgas Bay, south of Anchialos. The savior city Sozopolis and Pyrgos, tower in Greek, modern-day Burgas, were all returned to the empire in 1403 after juggling through Roman and Bulgarian control. Other settlements are also reported in the region during the time or few years prior, like Skafida, Rysokastron and Poros, with Burgas Pyrgos possibly constructed initially as a watchtower to serve those settlements. Agathopolis or Achtopol in Bulgarian was an ancient Greek colony that survived through the Roman Empire era up to the Middle Ages and was renamed by an Eastern Roman official who rebuilt it, named Agathon. Selymbria or Evdoxiopolis is located on the shores of Marmara, west of Constantinople, and was probably the most important city in Thrace after the capital at that point. It was the see of a metropolitan and also the place where the remains of Emperor Basil the Bulgar Slayer lay, after the former emperor was buried there by Michael VIII Palaiologos. During the times of Alexis Komnenos, the city was given as a trade center to the Venetians. Selymbria was also fortified and sustained a siege which lasted as much as the one of the capital. Vize or Vize in modern Turkish was the most inwardly located town in Thrace, on the top of a small hill in the Thracian plain. It was also fortified and possessed a church dedicated to God's holy wisdom, Hagia Sophia. The town was frequently used for military operations in the 13th and 14th centuries, signifying its importance. Vize was also occupied by the Ottomans during the previous years and returned to the empire in 1411, part of which remained up to the fall. The famous aqueducts of Constantinople also started from the vicinity of that town. Perinthos was an ancient Greek colony founded by the Samians, inhabitants of the Samos island in the 6th century BC, and remained an important city during the Macedonian and Roman periods. By the 1400s, its importance had diminished, but the site was certainly inhabited. Therapia fortress was located on the Bosporus Strait atop of a hill north of Constantinople and was besieged just before the final assaults on the capital. Therapia resisted for 2 days till its walls had been shattered by cannon fire and the bulk of its garrison killed. The survivors, 40 of them, then surrendered unconditionally. They were all put to death by impalement. A small castle called Studius, not to be confused with the Studius monastery of Constantinople, also existed at the time and was captured close to the siege. Prince Islands, the easternmost possession of the empire at that point, were also in the hands of the Romans in 1453, providing for a popular exile location for princes and members of the royal family till the end. In conclusion, several towns in Thrace, and with certainty many more small villages, were still controlled by the Eastern Romans in 1453, with a total population that might even surpass the 50,000 inhabitants of Constantinople at that time. The strategic depth of Vize, or the Black Sea towns, may not be underestimated, and could have provided for effective positions were the empire not in terminal decline due to its internal issues. It has to be noted that the efforts of Manuel II in 1403 still bore fruit in 1453, and the empire was in a much stronger position at the end, rather than 50 years prior to its fall, thanks to the Treaty of Gallipoli. It has to be mentioned that the Roman control of the Black Sea coast cities had also been reasserted by Prince Amadeo de Savoia after his Gallipoli Crusade in 1366 to 1367, having affirmed the Roman control of the region against the Bulgarians in the long term before the territories were conquered by the Turks and returned eventually to Eastern Rome by 1403. Several islands in the Aegean also remained in Roman hands up to 1453, with a varying degree of control, on which is still questionable how much influence the Roman state could truly assert with its meager naval power. However, with the help of the Genoese colonies, like the Gatilusio of Lesbos, who were vassals of the Romans, it may be possible that control could be achieved under certain circumstances. It is highly probable thus that the island of Lemnos and Imbros in the northwest Aegean were under Roman control, although under heavy Genoese influence. A notable person from Imbros was Critopoulos, a local historian with connections amongst the educated Roman elite at the time, who, after the Genoese protection, abandoned the island in 1453, reorganized it and managed to attain personal overlordship over it under Ottoman rule until 1466, where the Venetians finally took over. Critopoulos also managed to convince the Ottomans to hand over the control of Lemnos to the Genoese, and when he was asked by the Pope to join an anti-Turkish revolt, he refused. He became sympathetic to the Turks thanks to the gifts that he offered them when they tried to conquer Imbros after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. After the Venetian takeover of his home island, he moved to Constantinople, where he probably died. Regarding Lemnos, the island possessed two important fortifications, the castles of Kokkinos and Myrina. Kokkinos was defended by Constantine Palaiologos himself with the help of the Genoese in 1442 during one of his journeys to Constantinople. It was during that siege by the Turkish navy, which also used cannons, that the second wife of the emperor died while pregnant. Kokkinos may have been a Genoese Gatilusio possession, but Myrina was almost certainly Roman. During the siege of Constantinople in 1453, the whole island was promised by Constantine as a gift to Giovanni Giustiniani, if the defense was successful. Finally, there is evidence of Roman control over the Sporades islands, including Skyros, Kiathos, Skopelos and Alonissos, on the shores of Thessaly and east of the important island of Evia. The islands were probably sparsely populated and not of a big importance. the islands were conquered by the Venetians after 1204 and brought back to Roman control thanks to the knight Licario, acting under the orders of Michael Palaiologos in the 1270s. They may have remained Eastern Roman for the whole time since then, or occupied by the Turks and returned to the Romans after the Treaty of Gallipoli in 1403. Despite being relatively unimportant, Skiathos and Skyros possessed significant fortifications. Monasteries were an integral part of Eastern Roman society, many of which also participated in political struggles. With the Turkish conquests, several monasteries were permitted rights of self-governance and had their lands protected. Such was the case of the whole peninsula of Athos, close to Thessaloniki, where monasteries, after the conquest of the region in 1430, were allowed to retain much of their influence and serve as a saving board for many Greeks and other Orthodox peoples fleeing the Ottoman conquests. At the same time, the monasteries of the region became centers of cultural revival and enrichment during the era of decline, despite the regular theological debates. Their status in the Ottoman Empire was probably obtained thanks to the rugged terrain of the area, which, combined with elaborate defenses of the monasteries resembling citadels, made the complete subjugation of Athos not worth it. Finally, several scattered monasteries still existed and paid loyalty to the emperor or to the patriarch in Constantinople up to 1453, which managed to survive due to their remoteness, coupled with the favoritism shown by the Ottomans. One such case is the Strophades monastery on a small remote Ionian island, interestingly renovated with imperial expenses in 1440, or the Meteora monasteries in the mountains of central Greece, which were actually even gaining notoriety during the last years of the empire. Hundreds more monasteries existed all along mainland Greece, the Italian-held Aegean islands, and Asia Minor, and some even further east. The Greek populations outside the empire's borders had massively surged as a proportion to the one inside them. But could the empire influence them in any way? As seen by Constantine Palaiologos' attacks in mainland Greece in 1445 to 1446, local Greeks were enthusiastic to join his eventually failed expedition. In addition, Cretan fighters have joined the defense of Constantinople in the final siege, who are said to have volunteered for this act. Also, after 1453, many others soon joined revolts against the Ottoman rule, like under Crocodilos Kladas or the Palaiologi brothers when they tried to come back into their lost lands in Morea after 1461. On the other hand, though, populations in Thrace and Macedonia, as well as Asia Minor, may not have been so keen to join these movements en masse, probably having a bad experience under the last years of Roman overlordship, with the Ottoman taxes usually being more tolerable than the imperial ones. In addition to the Eastern Roman state, other Roman Greek entities still existed around the region. The Empire of Trebizond, the Principality of Theodoro, and the Latin state of the Despotate of Epirus. The diplomatic relations were usually good between them and Constantinople, but no substantial aid could be provided in any direction, as those states were in an even worse position than the Eastern Roman Empire. In the end, the only weapon the Roman Empire still possessed was its prestige and legitimacy. It was direct continuation of the Roman Empire, the state which every nation from Britain to Serbia and from Germany to Bulgaria tried to emulate. It was the last bulwark of Christianity in the sacred lands of the East. This prestige and diplomacy were alone enough to organize entire crusades to save the dying empire and drive flocks of volunteers to its side. If one of those crusades succeeded, as they could have well have, it is not hard to imagine Rome reasserting its dominion over the neighborhood of the Balkans. This prestige, coupled with the trustworthy and noble character of the last emperor, was enough to bring volunteers like Giovanni Giustiniani to the side of the Romans, the Ottoman Prince Orhan, and many other European volunteers from various Italian cities. In the end, territory-wise, Eastern Rome in 1453 controlled more territories than ancient Athens, Thebes or Sparta ever did, and they nevertheless managed to defeat the mighty Achaemenids. Even more surprisingly, the Eastern Roman state was larger in the 1450s rather than in the 1390s, after the rule of the two great men who tried to reverse the tide, father and son, Manuel II and Constantine XI Paleologi. Perhaps with a bit more luck and better internal organization, the phoenix could have risen again. Perhaps.